So we just finished talking about biodiversity and why biodiversity is important. So now let's kind of talk about some of the resources that having that biodiversity provides and different resources that are actually needed for basic human needs. So the basic human needs consist of land, water, food, energy, and mineral. So we're going to go through each of these and kind of talk about how they actually impact the human population. Keep in mind that a lot of the resources that Earth has is both non-renewable as well as renewable. And when we do consume resources, oftentimes it can lead to pollution, which is also another thing that we should need to consider. The first requirement for human needs is land. Land is a non-renewable resource, meaning we can't make more land, right? We're limited on how much land we actually have on Earth. And not only do we need land for a place for people to live on, but we also need land for agriculture to grow our different food, our crops, our livestock. We also need them for plants. Like the redwood trees, for example, is a huge carbon dioxide sink, and so it's vital that we have these different plants to kind of help with climate change. We also need land for just our day-to-day use, right? Highways, roads, schools, hospital, work. I mean, there's so much use of land that we need. Another thing we should consider is that a lot of the world's population live really close to the coastline. And so the issue here is that a lot of that area is slowly eroding or becoming desert because of just humans' use. This change in the land can result in loss of different habitats that are needed for wildlife to live around there. It also, with the erosion, becomes an issue when there is a storm because that land tends to be a buffer for like when there's a storm. But with the erosion, we're less protected if there is a storm. And so we can see here on United States, these different coasts, and it just kind of shows you in this picture how severely eroded these different lands are. Additionally, what we observe with regards to land is how our land is slowly becoming either desert or they're becoming deforested, right? We're cutting down the trees. So here we have this image right here. This is showing you the amount of areas that are undergoing desertification. So lands that were originally lush and with more green are slowly becoming a desert, similar to right here in this image. Oftentimes this is due to humans. So humans will use a lot of this land to raise different farm animals, and when humans allow animals to overgraze the land, oftentimes it will lead to desertification. So desertification is pretty much the converting of areas that are semi-arid. That means they're dry, they have a little bit of rain, and when they're not overgrazed, they have some greenery to them, but due to the overgrazing, these semi-arid land then becomes more desert-like. And so about 3/4 of the rangeland worldwide is now in danger of desertification. On the other side, we have deforestation. So this is when we used to have a nice lush forest, and it is due to the cutting of trees that we end up with this deforestation stage. So the problem with this is that when you remove the tropical forest that was normally on that land, you often leave soil that is now nutrient poor, is thinner. The trees that were removed often have a lot of nutrients that were associated with it. So now that you remove those trees, you lose all of those nutrients as well. Deforestation typically happens because we use lands that we usually deforest it, so we can use that land for basically ranges, right? So basically land used for agriculture or for animals to graze on. And so the dirt that's left over, like the soil that's left over, quickly loses its fertility, and that's one issue. In addition, deforestation, as you can imagine, a lot of different organisms probably rely on that forest. So now you're losing habitats for a lot of animals that were originally relying on that forest for either home or food. Additionally, the last part is that we're actually increasing atmospheric CO2 because those trees, once they're removed, are no longer able to take up the carbon dioxide. So they're no longer able to act as sink, right? And if you recall, carbon dioxide is taken up by the trees in order for it to do photosynthesis. Sorry, you guys, having hard times. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the next basic human need is water, right? And so the main use of water in the United States is actually for agriculture. So agriculture industry are actually the main use of water. 40% of that of the fresh water in the United States actually goes to irrigate crops, which is necessary to a certain extent, right? Because that's what provides us food. And it's found that compared to lower developed countries, more developed countries actually use a lot of their water source, not for drinking or cooking, but for bathing, flushing the toilet, or watering lawn. And in many regions, the number of humans that reside in a certain square footage exceeds the amount of water that's actually available. So if that's the case where there isn't enough water, what are different ways that we can actually supply fresh water? Well, one way is damming rivers, and another way is actually removing water from aquifer. We have an example of a dam right here. Right, this is a human-made dam, and the importance of dam is it can actually provide water, for fresh water for us. It's a good source of fresh water. But there's a lot of drawbacks to it. One of the drawbacks, for example, is that the river that used to flow through can no longer flow as they once did, which is going to impact the nearby wildlife that used to reside around where the river used to flow. Reservoir also uh, are susceptible to evaporation. So a lot of the water can be lost due to evaporation. And so when the water is evaporating, a lot of times that can leave back salt. And that remaining salt can make the water a little bit more unstable. A lot of build up of sediment, right, can also make it so that over time, the capacity of that dam gets smaller. So this first one is a dam. So that's one way that we can access fresh water. Another way that we can actually access fresh water is through aquifer. So aquifer, here's this example right here. And so this kind of gives you an illustration of what aquifer is. This is an example of an actual aquifer. So aquifer are natural reservoir that resides just below the Earth's surface. And so the water is residing underneath there. You can kind of see right here, we have this water reside. And so humans can actually access the aquifer in order to get fresh water. One of the rising issue, however, is that humans are accessing the aquifer, but they tend to deplete the groundwater of all the water that's in this aquifer. And that leads to the soil drying out, and it leads to the soil then settling and causing what we know as sinkholes. And so when you hear the term sinkhole, it's because the land is settling down because of the removal of all that water. As water is also being withdrawn to dam, as you're removing that water, you can leave back behind salt. And so this leads to the same issue that you have with dam, right? As you increase the amount of salt, it just makes the water whatever existing water is still existing there, a little more unstable. And as of right now, it is found that 2/3 of the world's populations are living in countries where they're actually facing serious water shortage. So looking at both land and water, a lot of the damage is caused due to our agricultural practice, right? So if we look at the effect of farming, this is a lot of the issue that leads to us depleting both our land and our water resources. So currently, there are about 8 billion people on this earth, and the average amount, of course, is going to vary per person, but the average person needs about 2,500 calories per day, right? So you can imagine that we need a sustainable amount of food. And most of our food comes from either growing crops, raising different animals, or accessing fish from seas and lakes. So in order for us to be able to feed everyone on the earth, we rely on modern farming. But what are some of the harmful practices that modern farming leads to? Well, one of them is planting very few genetic variety. And so picking like one strand, for example, of corn and just planting that. What's the issue with that? Well, without that biodiversity as far as the number of corn, if a virus is found to hit the corn, for example, it can wipe out all the crops, right? Because the genetics the same across. None of the clones have built any type of resistance. This can also play the same if abiotic factors influences the crop. So if we're planting one crop, and let's say we have a year that's really high in temperature, the crop that we have, they will all respond the same way, and maybe they don't have genetic background that would make it so that they can handle the sun and rise in temperature as easily as like wild crops that exist in that area. Additionally, using a large amount of fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides is harmful. A lot of those have certain residual remnants that can lead to runoff into our drinking water supply that maybe we don't want. Another one is the irrigation, using irrigation that requires a lot of water sources. And then we also have modern farming leading to excessive fuel consumption, right? So all of the different machineries that are needed to grow these different crops. So these are some of the harmful practices that modern farming has. Additionally, it's found that in the more developed countries that there are some issues because we do eat so much more protein in our diet with regards to having to either desertification or deforestation, because we're needing that land for us to provide land for animals to graze on. In lower developing country, they consume less protein, but now the problem is that their diet is mainly low protein, high carb, which can lead to malnutrition. So in many lower developing countries, we see instance of kwashiorkor, which is caused by severe protein deficiency. This is often seen in infant and children that are aged 1 to 3 that are no longer breastfeeding because they're no longer able to get that protein source from their mom. So let's look at some of the example of modern farming that we just discussed. So as we can see in this first picture, we have some cows grazing on livestock feed, and 2/3 of the land in the United States is devoted to providing crops for these livestock feed. So when we're thinking about farming, we're not only farming crops for ourselves, but also for our livestock. Additionally, a large percentage of the resource that we use to raise these livestock includes using fossil fuel, fertilizer, water, and herbicide and pesticides. The second picture, we have this man getting this land ready for providing for farmland, right? And so in the United States, we tend, like as you go down the road and you're looking at the different sites and the farms, you'll notice that we tend to grow all of our crops in straight rows, and it tends to be the same crop, right? Like you'll see a set of crops that's specifically, let's say, corn versus certain type of trees, like cherry trees or apple trees. And so this leads to really high soil erosion rate. A lot of the topsoil will be lost, leaving just the bare soil to act on the water and wind. And what does this lead to? Well, as we discussed before, when we lose that topsoil, a lot of times this leads to the farmland becoming a desert. It leads to a desertification. Additionally to the way that we plant our crops, we also set up irrigation. And so this irrigation, land that's set up with irrigation are prone to accumulating a lot of the mineral salt. And so that salt is going to get deposited into the land as well. And so we end up with land that has very high salt content, which is also bad when we have that accumulation of salt. And lastly, we have here our fishing. So there's two ways that fishes are often produced as far as food. There's one which is fishing using a drag net, and there's another one where we have farms that are set up, and this is aqua farming here. So these are two example of fishing methods. Fishing on a wild source had become an issue because we have found that between 1970s to 1990s, there has been like just double the amount of boats that are out there fishing. So we're kind of overfishing our different natural resources. See this with the Atlantic bluefin tuna. It is predicted that this tuna might become extinct in the next few years, and this is due to just overfishing. Another problem is a lot of times when we do fish, the fishermen are going out for a specific type of fish or organism. So, for example, the shrimp fishery go out with the intention of catching shrimp, and they do catch shrimp. So they catch 3.5 million tons of shrimp a year. However, they're also catching a lot of other animals that are living in the water, right? And so they end up discarding 9.5 million tons of other animals that are caught along with the shrimp, because they're only interested in shrimp. And so this all the other animals are discarded because it's not their target animal that they're trying to catch. So one way that we can tackle this is to actually do aqua farming. And so aqua farming has found to actually reduce a lot of that pressure on the wild population. Lastly, one of the other basic human needs that we need is energy source. And there are two sources that we use. The first one is the nuclear power that accounts for about 6%. And the other one is fossil fuel, which accounts for about 81% of our energy use. With the nuclear power, which is shown here as an example, the concern is that nuclear power is dangerous, right? And just releases a lot of waste, a lot of radioactive waste. So we don't want to rely on nuclear power a lot because of the harmful aspects of it. The other source that we use a lot is fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is a non-renewable source, which means that once we use it up, that's it. It takes a long time to actually make fossil fuel. And so fossil fuel is actually the compressed remain of organisms that died long ago. So because it takes millions of years for fossil fuel to be made naturally, once we use our sources, we are pretty much depleted of fossil fuel. And Additionally, fossil fuel releases a lot of pollutants when we actually do burn it. So when we actually do burn it for energy, the offset of fossil fuel is that we can actually release a lot of pollutants. And the more developed country will use a lot more energy compared to the low developed country. So one person in a more developed country use about the same amount of energy in one day as a person in a lower developed country uses in a year. That's pretty significant when you compare 1 year to 1 day. And again, like I said, there's a lot of pollutants that are released, right? So we have greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. We can release certain acids, certain volatile organic molecules, certain radioactive material. And so the release of all of this is just adding more pollutant to Earth. Additionally, the greenhouse gas right here, like CO2, the increased release of CO2 leads to global warming, right? So it leads to temperature rising. And as the temperature rising, even if it's just a few degrees, it could lead to different consequences. So we can feel with regards to the temperature rising. We also have right here, for example, coral bleaching, where that small little percentage of increased temperature can lead to these coral reefs dying off. And these coral reefs are home to a lot of different animals in that area. So now we're actually endangering not only the coral reef, but all the animals that rely on it for food and habitat. So what are some of the solutions? Well, we can try and come up with different type of renewable energy source. So here we have wind power, right? And so it's expected that wind power will probably be the largest source of renewable energy source in the future. We can also do hydropower, which is basically making it so that as water's falling, we're using that kinetic energy and converting it into potential energy, which will come in form of electricity. So currently, this accounts for about 31% of the energy that's being used in the United States at the current time. However, in order to make this action of this movable water, a lot of times we set up dams, and we already talked about how dams can be damaging to the environment. Lastly, another renewable source is using energy from the sun. So you guys have probably seen this around different campuses on the parking garage, different homes have it, and these are using photovoltaic solar cells. So basically taking energy from the sun and making it to a usable energy for us to use. And so how it works is that there are like different wafers in here that are electron emitting metals. And so when the metals are contacting with another metal and there's electrons, we can take that electron, which is full of energy, and pass it down. And that's how we kind of harness the energy in solar. Okay, so this is it for this section. In the next section, we'll talk about how do we go about having a sustainable society.